So, Marissa,
Hey, Sandeep, how are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
Very good, very good.
Thanks for joining in. And just waiting for Pavla and Alexander.
Hey, how's it going?
Hello, Alexander. How are you doing?
Doing great, thanks. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks for jumping in. Hello, Pavla. How are you doing?
Hi, doing great.
Awesome. Thank you, Marissa, Alexander, and Pavla for joining our panel discussion today. I'm really excited. All three of you have done such remarkable work in the area of remote work, and all of us have experienced remote work in some way, and especially so in the last 12 months. And some of this. There's almost 5 million people, even before COVID-19, who are already working remote, from home or elsewhere. And during this time, 88% of organizations, this is some research data that was published, 88% organizations worldwide actually made it mandatory for employees to work from home during the pandemic. And in fact, in a recent Bloomberg survey, we found that 39% of employees would consider quitting their jobs if their employers weren't flexible enough about remote work. Now, that is staggering. However, as a society, we find that we still have to wrap our heads around how can we use remote work to our advantage and not be chained by the management paradigms of the past. So for this and to dive straight into it, I'm really delighted to invite Marissa, Goldberg, Pavla, Bobosikova, and Alexander Embiricos to our panel today. I hope I was able to kind of say your names correctly. And before I introduce our guests, a quick look at our agenda for today. We have a very interesting set of topics to dive into with our panel, and we'll follow that up with a short 5 to 10 minute Q&A. We also have at the end of the webinar, we have a very exciting offer for the attendees. So stay on for the panel discussion, and we'll be revealing what we have for you just before we dive into the Q&A. So let's get started by speaking to our panelists. So first, I'd like to introduce to all of you Marissa Goldberg. Marissa has been working remotely since 2015 for several years, and she's managed distributed teams across 20 plus countries. A couple of years ago, she started Remote Work Prep to help companies create effective virtual environments for remote employees. And her goal is to help others thrive remotely without going through years of trial and error. One other thing I want to share about Marissa is I was actually amazed to learn about how she fought back when she was faced with a big personal injury situation. That has been so inspiring. And more recently, she decided to give up a full-time job, and her boss actually encouraged her to take what is now, I think, going to be coined as entrepreneurial leave instead of quitting. Now, with those quick words, I'd like to invite Marissa to talk about her passion for remote work, and if you want to share a personal anecdote or a fun fact about yourself.
Yes, thank you so much for the intro. You pretty much covered everything. I would say that just one extra thing is just I used the extra time that I got from switching to remote work to become an elected official for my district. So that just gives you one example of what you can possibly do with that extra time. And I initially fell in love with remote work 6 years ago. I went from a toxic tech environment, switched over to remote, realized like what could be possible when I can optimize my own work environment. And yeah, everything else is history now. So that's me.
That's amazing. Thank you for contributing to the community as well. I'd now like to introduce Pavla. Pavla is a very curious and enthusiastic, result-driven person. She's working at the forefront of solving the future of remote productivity and engagement. She's the co-founder and CEO of WFHomie. Love that name, Pavla. And she's helping leaders keep their teams happy, healthy, and productive while being engaged. Pavla, if I can invite you to share a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for the intro, Sandeep. I think for me, one additional kind of anecdote or contextual story here towards why I started working towards helping organizations figure out remote first work is previously, right before the pandemic, an organization where I was leading product got acquired by a company that I believed at the time was like top of the class when it comes to employee engagement and how they engage their people. They had just raised their Series B based out of San Francisco. And I remember flying in and being just so impressed with how amazing their people processes are working and how it can kind of supercharge how the organizations operate and, become successful faster because just everybody's putting in their heart in it. And then suddenly when with the rest of the world, we went into, at the time, COVID remote, which of course it's its own category. I remember feeling the stark difference, and that really got me thinking about how might we come back to that level as soon as we can.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you, Pavla. Next, I'd like to introduce Alexander. Alexander is he's the co-founder of Remotion. He's also a creative product thinker at the core, and Remotion is the virtual office for hybrid teams. Alexander's, we're speaking earlier, and you're saying they see this, leveraging flexibility of remote work and connecting of working together as a person, and looking forward to like how they can help teams do more so as offices started reopening. Alexander, can I invite you to say a couple of words about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for the intro. Also covers it a lot. I think every day I'm excited to get to work with our team at Remotion, folks, across 4 continents, 8 different cities. Actually, no, 4 continents, 8 countries, 10 different cities, and it's just so cool to be working with people from all over the world. And so I think the pandemic was incredibly tough, but if there is a silver lining, it's I think that many companies are trying to think about now how they can work with more flexibility for folks, more diverse teams, and still get a lot done and achieve their business objectives. So really exciting to be here today.
Awesome, thank you once again. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Sandeep, and I'm the co-founder at Truly Financial. Our work has involved really working, kind of deeply with smaller businesses, across the US and Canada, and a few other countries as well. And what we found is that smaller businesses across many different industries, both tech and non-tech, they really struggle with remote work because a lot has been said about remote work, but it's very hard for them to really apply it in their context. And today's webinar is our effort in kind of making it easier for them to adopt this and really become efficient at using remote work in ways that can grow their organizations. So thank you everybody for the quick introduction. So let's dive right into our webinar discussion. So we have a bunch of very interesting topics, and my panelists here today, they've been really helpful in designing and making this in a structure which I think hopefully adds a lot of value to our attendees today. So first, let's start by unpacking remote work. So I'm addressing this to Marissa, and we'll kind of go around the panel as well. So remote work tends to be nowadays used to describe every job that's really not in person. And for obvious reasons, this has gotten a lot of attention during COVID-19. So what's different about like pandemic remote versus normal remote?
Absolutely, yeah. So I was one of those 5 million people who was remote for pre-pandemic, and the difference is night and day. And I think that a majority of people who are remote right now may have first experienced it while during the pandemic. And the difference is that the core concept behind remote working effectively is that you're providing agency to the individual. So before remote, the in-office experience would kind of give a one-size-fits-all approach. So they would say, come into the office 9 to 5. It doesn't matter if you work better at night. You come in 9 to 5. You come into this office that might be an open office plan, even though you might need more a singular focused area to do your best work. It was very much a one-size-fits-all approach versus remote. When it's done effectively, it gives the agency to the individual. So they get to decide the hours that work best for them. They get to decide where they work best, all of those kind of things. Now, the thing with the pandemic is it shut a lot of those things down. So even if they had the power to, they could no longer work from, let's say, like a co-working space or from a coffee shop environment, or they couldn't really go anywhere else. Not only that, but like their kids might have been home. They couldn't take advantage of the extra perks that come with working remotely, like traveling, or like doing things in the middle of the day, like you'd go out and hang out with friends for a bit and then come back and work for a couple of hours. So all of those things were shut down. And I really hope that people don't get the idea that pandemic remote is the only way to work. I know we've been doing it for a year. I know that like habits have formed, but there's a much better opportunity out there. And if you've liked pandemic remote, just wait until you see normal remote.
Yeah, and you can already see, and especially the larger organizations have started to kind of send out so many different mixed signals in terms of what they expect their teams and their employees to do post-pandemic. So that's definitely something interesting, to watch out for. I'll pass this on to Pavla, and kind of leading from what Marissa was saying about pandemic versus normal remote. There are many different interpretations of remote work. So from an organization's perspective, what would be some of the ways to understand what it means for them, and of course there's the employee's perspective as well.
Thank you. Great question. I think many organizations are still kind of figuring out what that means. And from our experience, from what we're hearing, I think late last year, there's been a set of organizations that have readily committed to being remote first or being fully remote, like Twitter, Shopify, some others. And then there's been a lot of organizations kind of stuck in the limbo of either committing to, we'll wait it out, or to fully saying, we will try this and see what happens. And now what we're seeing as an organization is a lot of these teams currently going through the process of starting to commit to remote first and being unclear on what that means. So I think technically step one is probably around how big of an HQ office are they keeping, and are they starting to hire globally and basically outside of their HQ area. I think that is the first kind of tangible understanding of we are committed to remote now. And then whatever unfolds after that is, okay, what does it mean now to engage and to foster some kind of culture in an organization? And I think that is a big unknown that we're of course trying to fill with some of the activities that we're doing, whether it comes to helping teams bond remotely, or different organizations experimenting with what does it mean to collaborate effectively? Do we work sync or async? But I think step one is kind of this commitment of, okay, we are now a hiring global workforce, which I personally think is a great step, because of course it means that organizations are hiring the best person for the job, not the best person for the job on the block, which is oftentimes not the case.
Yeah, that's a really kind of interesting way of putting it. About like hiring not just across the block. That also leads me into the next kind of it's a very good segue into what I want to ask from Alexander about this thing about the local optimum, and this kind of jumps off from what you were just saying, Pavla. So many businesses, in fact, most businesses in their early days, they start with a very strong local optimum. Now, whether that means they're hiring their initial team, from the same block or the next block, or even for the fact that they're serving customers in that in that city or that neighborhood. So this, as this was tightly tied to the construct of the 8 hours 5-day work week, and the kind of the management paradigm that evolved is that people are working in offices, and then they, you measure them by the fact that they're seen in the office. So how can traditional managers, how could they start to measure productivity on the basis of work done, and not just on the basis of the hours that employees have clocked? Alexander, if you could kind of show some perspective.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I like to think about this framework of input-based management versus output-based management. How are you measuring what your workforce is doing? Is it cool if I just quickly rip off something Pavla mentioned first, though, or from a flow perspective? Let me mention one thing, which is, I think a lot about like how can startups benefit the most from remote work, and there are like many different options. There's like a full spectrum, right? Like I think all of us are seeing that like the workforce, like that, that number you mentioned, the workforce demands flexibility now, and like 39% of people are considering leaving their jobs if they're not flexible. But you could be a company and offer flexibility to work from home, but still only hire locally, right? And then there's a step further. You decide to hire everywhere in your state or in your country. Each time there's more regulatory stuff to deal with, or you could hire globally. And something that I'm interested to talk about later today is like, I think we're seeing different models depending on what the companies are choosing. Like, are they doing like 3 days a week in the office and then 2 days work from home, or are they doing fully distributed? And so it's interesting to see how companies are shaking this out. And that obviously has enormous implications on how productivity is measured. So yeah, honestly, like I'm kind of excited to see that output-based management is becoming more and more necessary, because I think even if you work from an office, it's a great thing to do, right? The idea of, as a manager, sitting down with your reports and saying like, okay, what do we need to get done? Can we commit to a certain amount that we both think is reasonable? And then giving agency, as Marissa was saying, to the individual, letting them figure out how to get that work done, and then checking in at that time to see whether or not they got the work done. I think that for really large tasks, when you can delegate and really give that agency, things work really well. A failure mode as manager is not creating that check-in point later down the line. It's very important, if you're going to delegate, to create a check-in point to hold people accountable later. It also works really well for small tasks. If you have some task management system, let's say we're talking about like a customer support role where there are tickets, you can easily measure that. I think one of the places where output-based management gets more challenging is when we're talking about like medium-sized tasks where there would frequently need to be a lot of check-ins. And so that's a place where I think, you've just got to try to really build trust with your reports and know that they'll ask the right questions at the right time.
Yeah, the output-based management framework is something which many managers are unfamiliar with, and that also brings in another aspect which I think Pavla also touched upon, and I want to throw this to Marissa. It's about this whole concept of discipline. And we're really talking about like, what does the workday look like, both from the employee's perspective and the employer's perspective, or the manager's perspective. So in back in the day when we were commuting, either while you're on the way to work or you're in the office, we always had people around us, and that in part contributes to some element of discipline, because when you're in a social environment, you tend to behave differently as compared to like when you're on your own. So from an employee's perspective, what do you think are some of the challenges in creating discipline during the workday, especially when most of your work is on the computer or the phone, and you don't have your manager or even your coworkers around you?
Yeah, it's something that takes some time to get used to. So I think in person, we're very disciplined at looking busy and maybe using that social pressure to look like we're being disciplined when it's not necessarily working on the right tasks or such like that. So I think what we have is an opportunity to instead switch off that part of us that's like, oh, I have to use this energy towards looking a certain way. And instead we're using this energy to actually get things done properly. And I think at first that freedom that comes with remote work, where I get to decide how I work, seems amazing. And then you get started on that first day, you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do? Like, this is a lot of freedom over all at once. It's very overwhelming. So there's a couple of things I tend to recommend to people to keep discipline throughout the day when working remotely. So the first is to make the choice before you're in the moment. So when you're in the moment, there's like a zillion things and you're feeling a certain way and you might be affected by certain things, versus if the night before you laid out your schedule and you said, in the morning, I'm going to do this. Then first thing when you wake up, you already know I'm doing this. So you're not starting the day with 50 choices. So make the choice before you're in the moment. Second would be virtual boundaries. So these are much more important than physical boundaries when it comes to remote work. I'll repeat that. It's much more important than physical boundaries. I know people talk about physical boundaries all the time. Virtual boundaries are what you need. So a lot of people who are working remotely are using the same device to do their personal stuff. So like go on Twitter and watch Netflix and all of that stuff. And then also for work. So their work email, all of that stuff. you need to be able to separate those notifications. So when you're off, you're not seeing those work notifications. And when you're on doing work, you're not seeing, oh, hey, someone posted on Twitter and I really like their tweet, so let me go check that. So create those virtual boundaries. You can do it in a bunch of different ways, browser users, you can use that. You can use multiple desktops, all these different things. I have a whole article. You can search my name and virtual boundaries to look up, and it gives you step by step. And then the last part is incorporating rest into work. So what we see is that when people go remotely, start working remotely, is that they're not underworking, they're overworking. So they're spending that extra time putting it into work because they want people to know that they're doing their job. They appreciate the freedom and they don't want it taken away. So instead, they spend all their time answering emails as soon as they come through, or their Slack messages as soon as they come through. You need to create rest points, and it's actually better for your work overall. So like one of the things that I'll do is like I'll get stuck on something and it'll just be me looping. So I'll go take a shower, and then all of a sudden I have all these ideas, or I'll go take a walk around the block and I come back fresh. Without that, I would have just spent that like 30 minutes just sitting here looping. It's not helpful for the work, and it's not helpful for me mentally. So those are 3 things that'll really help you be disciplined.
I just like plus 1,000, all of that. That stuff is great.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Sandeep.
I think they're going to take you up on like a one-on-one session after this to help me with my virtual boundaries.
Exactly, I'm taking notes like crazy. Awesome.
Can I add one thing to that as well? Like I feel really strongly about this. Plus 1,000, as I said. I think another aspect of this is, that pressure to reply to the Slack message right away so that people can tell you're busy. It's real, and I think that something that can really help is having an open discussion about that with your team. And saying, like, for example, I'm a manager and I know that people want to reply to me quickly. So it's actually very helpful for me to tell them, hey, like, I don't want you to reply to me immediately, because if you do, that means you got distracted, right? And so empowering people to like take their own time. It's like, hey, I want you to take breaks because that means you're fresher. I want you to declare when you won't be working, so that way you can focus when you are working. Empowering your teammates to do that, especially if you're a manager or you're running a business, I think can be a great way to actually not only help them be happier, but also help them get more done.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think to what both of you were saying, it's very critical to help employees rewire the way they think about their work day. Because hey, if you're working from home, I'd love to take that shower at 1 p.m. and especially at in summer when it's getting warm, and there should not be any feeling of like they're shirking work, or they're not at the desk and they're not able to reply to that Slack message within minutes. It's totally fine, right? So so this rewiring is a process, and just a quick note for our attendees on the webinar today. All of the resources and some really nice information and tips that we're discussing today, we would be sending this to you, for on email or whichever way, and along with the recording of today's session as well. So don't worry about missing anything. We'll make sure that all of these important tips are in your inbox. Let's move over to we've spoken about the work day and the 9 to 5 like work construct. This also comes with, we're all on a Zoom call right now. It's a Zoom webinar, and who hasn't felt Zoom fatigue? So let's talk about like meeting anxiety and stress. I'm going to have this question for Pavla. When you have a hybrid work environment, you have some people who are like very familiar with each other, because they're in the same office. Some people are remote. As far as managers are concerned, like what would they do to make sure that when there are online meetings, everyone in that meeting is heard, and not just the people who are generally more vocal, the familiar voices. And especially how can introverts in the organization be given their own voice, given that they're usually not very vocal?
Yeah, no, that is a great and very important question for sure. And as Marissa in the beginning kind of mentioned, the remote work gives us opportunity to kind of cater to different sets of individuals versus the office being kind of one size fits all. So I think the way that we think about how to make sure that everybody's involved and engaged and has the opportunity to be heard, it really comes down to the leader's ability or the company's ability to build an environment where people trust each other. and where there's an expectation for being open and sharing and whatnot. And all of that, of course, starts with onboarding, but oftentimes what we're seeing that a lot of organizations kind of hyper focus on onboarding and making sure that the first 5 or 30 days of a person's experience are great and that they get to meet all the relevant people. But after that, oftentimes the ball drops. So what I think is really important is making sure that teams have this kind of recurring opportunity to get to know each other in the outside of work context, and that the boss and the quiet person and the loudest person have the opportunity to learn a little bit about each other and perhaps understand where everybody's coming from. And that way really take the stress off when the meeting is happening. So it's not per se about something that can be done differently necessarily at the moment of the meeting happening, but what can be done in all of those other times to make sure that when that meeting comes up, that everybody's in this position where they can openly share.
Yeah, thank you. And also kind of, related to that question is, is the aspect of being on camera. And Alexander, this is for you. It takes a lot of energy to be on camera, and especially when you know that you're being watched. And it's probably more than what it is in person. Also when you're on camera, you miss those body language, those cues. When you're sitting in a chair all day long. So this is more from the employee's point of view, or like any participant in a meeting. How can they become like more comfortable when they're doing video calls and really be in the moment and not feel like conscious about it?
Yeah, great question. I'm sure all of us have so many thoughts on this topic. I think my favorite one is kind of a cheeky answer, which is like, do you need to be on camera? Or do you need to have a meeting? Yes, remote, like everyone's like, yes. So like, I think, more seriously, like a question is like, when do you actually need to have a scheduled meeting? Like, even if going to the office, having a day full of scheduled meetings is exhausting. So to the extent that scheduled meetings can be replaced with text or documents or writing or Looms, or even like short ad hoc meetings sometimes that are in a focused time, I think that's great. And then if you do decide you need to meet, need to have a scheduled meeting, I think there's a question as to like, when do you need the video versus not? Some folks, and myself included, really are advocates of doing one-on-ones, walking around outdoors with audio only. I think that can be very effective. Now, that said, to actually answer your question, like if you've got to be on video, I think there's some very simple things that everyone can do in apps like Zoom to help. So for example, turning off your self video is like, you can mouse over yourself right now, click the 3 dots. That way you'll stop paying attention to yourself. It's like no longer looking into a mirror. You're less conscious of what you're doing. Some other things that can help are, getting a change of scene, like standing up. So like I'm standing right now, I'm moving around a bit and kind of getting comfortable with that. I'm curious, Marissa, Pavla, Sandeep, you must all have suggestions for how to make video less fatiguing.
99% of the time it's not needed. That's pretty much my take on it. Unless it's a relationship building call, you most likely don't need video, and it's most likely actually distracting you from what's important on the call. So yeah. I think a lot of people know that's my take, but yeah.
Personally, a huge fan of the walking meetings, and actually love when I see my phone ring as opposed to the seeing this person has joined the meeting, which means like, oh my God, we all get this free time. So I think I have to be better kind of advocate of it myself, but I love when somebody does it to me. So big fan of that.
Yeah, I've started loving going back to just a regular phone call. It just feels so refreshing and different. I think we need more of that for sure. Let's kind of move this discussion into the aspect of creating trust. So there are many different there's many different ways to look at what are the problems with trust. From an employee's perspective, they're dealing with isolation, the lack of synchronization, and how do they discuss shared goals with their teams when they're not in person? Like those impromptu meetings are not happening. Pavla, I'm going to address this to you. How do you create trust when you barely see your colleagues or your boss like in person? And especially, what does this mean for new talent who hasn't had the benefit of knowing, the existing team, IRL or in real life in that sense?
Yeah, so I think as it's already been kind of shared, the concept that a lot of this boils down from how the leadership is kind of leading by example here. And I know that especially with organizations moving into remote first, so not fully remote, and what then happens with leadership, i.e. does it mean that all of the executive team ends up going to the office, and that kind of creates this expectation that everybody else should, and it kind of breaks the model a little bit. So I think when it comes to building trust, again, it's something that mostly comes from leadership, how vulnerable they choose to be with the team, where they set the boundary around what is appropriate to share, what's not, how they invite others to show up at work and to share, and to just be transparent around what's going on with their lives, how they're feeling, and whatnot. So especially as new folks come in, it will really resonate. The culture that's been built prior to them joining will be very clear. So I think everybody should just keep themselves in check and pay close attention to what they're like telecommunicating to the world, because that will just translate to every next person who will join.
Yeah. I kind of, leading on to that about, creating a safe environment. Marissa, like, what can organizations do about creating a psychologically safe environment where individuals can express their concerns, or if they have challenges with any tasks, they can talk about that, without having the anxiety that they're creating friction. And like I said, those visual cues are totally missing. Oftentimes, we're not even talking about like video and audio. Stuff is just happening on Slack or on a chat or email. What could be some of the ways in which both managers as well as employees can create that environment where they don't have the anxiety of rubbing somebody the wrong way, or not knowing how the other person will react?
Yeah, there's a couple things that I see companies routinely get wrong in this area. So one, they'll say that it's okay to bring up issues, but then when someone does bring up issues, they go into defensive or attack mode. So instead of just telling people that yes, they can bring up issues, you need to show, not just tell. The other thing is that they put the burden on the employees to come to you with issues. So it's more reactive instead of proactive. So instead of doing that, you need to like proactively ask for feedback and then crowdsource solutions from the team. So first you say, you ask specifically, instead of like, oh, how are things going? You ask, oh, is there anything that you think could be done better on this specific project? What do you think about that? And then instead of just saying like yes or no, they're actually having to dive deeper into like specific things. So you're leaving it open, and you're specifically asking for that kind of feedback. And then as well, once you get that feedback, then you take it to the rest of the team and say, hey, so I recently became aware that this might be an issue. What do you think we can do to solve this, so that you're not just going out and solving it yourself when you didn't even see the issue in the first place? You're getting it from the team that was affected. Then once that's done and you start implementing things, make sure that you actually like follow through, obviously, but then go ahead and give a shout out to the person who originally brought it to your attention. Call it out to the rest of the team being like, hey, this person went above and beyond, and I wouldn't have known about this, and we wouldn't have been able to put this fix in place without them. So kudos. So then you're showing and telling people that it's okay to bring things up, and it's actually encouraged. And so this creates a culture where friction is encouraged to be like out in the open instead of hidden away, waiting to explode.
Yeah, that's very valuable. And there's probably a huge need for creating that organizational muscle, almost, if you will, where these kind of conversations are encouraged, and managers are also kind of coached to find opportunities to trigger those kind of conversations, which most often just gets lost because everything on the face of it looks pretty okay. It's a great thought. I want to move this to Alexander, and it's again related to creating trust. How much of responsibility for creating trust is on the business leadership, and not just the managers? So if you look at in an office situation when people are meeting each other, there's a natural outcome of those interactions, just because you're rubbing shoulders with other people. But does the business owner also have a responsibility in making sure that that trust is being created and not just left to employees and managers to find out on their own.
Yeah, I think 100%, like your job as a leader is to obviously curate your team, but then give your team the environment they need to thrive. And trust is the most basic thing. So yeah, I think 100% that's part of the responsibility. I think that can feel really scary when you're also sitting at a computer at home and everyone else is sitting at a computer at home, and you're like, how do I get these people to trust each other? And so going to Marissa's point, I actually think one of the best, most powerful things you can do is just discuss it with the team and be like, hey, like, it recently came to my attention. I took notes on your framing, that like, I don't know if you would want to say it exactly this way, but like trust is something that's really important to us and we should work on. How do you all think we can work on our trust with each other? So I think like labeling it as something that matters to you as a leader, and then beginning to discuss with the team on ideas, modeling behaviors that show trust, such as asking for feedback and then giving kudos on the feedback, and then sharing with, like, really emphasizing with the team how much that matters. Those are great ways to build trust. I think some of the other things like have been mentioned earlier, right? So like your onboarding really matters here. The way that you recognize people in general really matters. The way that you invite people to bring more of themselves to work. Because in an office, you would see more of a person. You would know that they're going to a baseball game afterwards or whatever it is, whereas remotely you don't. So inviting people to share more of that. And if you can, as COVID ends, doing in-person meetups, there are a lot of great ways that you can do it, but it's absolutely your job as a leader to do so, I think.
That's really so important. I think in this entire discussion so far, I find this aspect of trust and how we can like really be intentional about it cannot be overemphasized. Thank you for that. I also want to quickly kind of remind our attendees, please feel free to ask any questions. There's a Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen, and we will be taking a few questions at the end of this. So feel free to go in and type in your questions. You don't have to wait till the end of the webinar, and we will be starting to take questions once we're done with this kind of initial discussion here. Now kind of moving from trust to the aspect of hybrid work. So a lot has been spoken about this hybrid work week, and as we get more and more vaccines into arms, that's becoming the next, I guess, kind of buzzword. So Marissa, I have this question for you. Some companies have started to mandate hybrid work week company-wide, whereas others are expecting only certain job functions to be back in the office. For an organization, what are the ways in which they can look at how do they structure across their teams, and like, is hybrid actually going to become the new normal?
I hope not. I am not a fan. However, so there's a couple of things here. So one, you have to remember that remote work is not new. You have a lot of things to learn from the past, and some very big names in the past have attempted hybrid and it has failed tremendously. So Yahoo would be one example of that. So the thing with remote work is you need everybody to have equal ability and opportunity to contribute. It's very hard to make sure that happens for the remote workplace and for the people who are working in office at the same time, at the same rate, like everything the same, equal, like I said, equal opportunity. And then we go back to the core concept of remote being give agency to the individual. Most of these hybrid concepts are saying, oh, come in for 3 days of the week. You have to come in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or whatever it is. And then they have to be in during those times that were standard work hours. They can no longer work when they needed to. So you're taking away that agency for people to work most effectively. So their productivity is going to go down. And then it's also from the individual perspective, they're seeing what they can do at home and working from home, and then they're going into the office the next day and being like, oh my gosh, I wasted so much time commuting. I wasted so much time being pulled into like one conversation or the other, and I didn't get done what I intended to get done. So they're seeing the difference firsthand, and that can be very frustrating. So if you are going to attempt hybrid, the hybrid option, you have to remember, one, equal opportunity. The person who is making the policies for remote workers should be remote themselves. It should not just be someone who is in the corporate office. Also giving agency to the individual. So make it extremely flexible policy. Like, we have this office for you to come into. feel free to, but don't designate the days that they absolutely have to come in. Have the office there for celebrations, for like team retreats, that kind of stuff. But it should not be like a you have to come in kind of thing. Keep that optionality open. So yeah, that's what I would have to say about that.
Yeah, it's, I guess one of the things is it's very hard to break habits, and managers and team leaders and entrepreneurs, business owners, they tend to go back to what they're familiar with. And like when we started, we were saying many of them are actually not familiar about how to deal with remote work in a non-pandemic situation, right? And so therefore, is hybrid really a good thing for them, or is not great, or maybe it's not needed altogether? It's really hard for them to navigate all these choices. And I guess, I guess this is one of the areas which is going to be really interesting. Is there, we've seen a lot happening, from initial kind of, wetting their feet with remote to full remote, and now kind of, going back into some form of hybrid, and maybe some organizations will become like, fully in office. I hope not. But Alexander, is there data around what kind of office reopenings are happening, and what kind of hybrid models are really being adopted? Apart from the general trend that we are seeing, what kind of data are we seeing on this?
Yeah, and I'd also love to hear what data Marissa and Pavla are seeing, because this is, and what you're seeing, because this is so new and it's continuously changing. But a lot of the surveys that we've looked at Remotion, so actually I agree with a lot of what Marissa said about having to level the playing field for remote to work. But then we actually at Remotion think hybrid can be great. It's really hard. So it's been interesting, like we're talking to a lot of teams who are trying things. And so the data we see across the US is like, it's constantly fluctuating, but it's like 1/5-ish of teams are looking to like fully return to the office. Between 1 and 2/5 are looking at staying more fully distributed. And a lot of those companies are the companies that maybe they started during COVID or they were remote before COVID. Fewer that did it during COVID. And then many companies right now think, and we'll see if they succeed, that hybrid is the way to go. It seems to be like a small majority. But within there's a lot of variance in what it is. Most companies are proposing something that I hope doesn't become the standard, which is, hey, we're going to do like Mondays remote, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays in the office, and Fridays remote. I think in a way, from an employee flexibility perspective, that's a step in the right direction, more flexibility. But I do think that it's still not that flexible, and it can lead to awkwardness if you have some people who are like fully remote and some people who are coming in 2-3 days a week. It's a bit messy, but I'd love to talk about why those companies are doing that, because I think it's pretty interesting. The other set of companies we're seeing are doing basically full employee choice where there exists an office, and you can go there if you live in a small apartment and you don't have room to work from home, or if you want to go in and collaborate about something, but generally it's like fully up to you whether or not you use the office. And also you can live far away from the office, and that's totally fine. That's really what I hope will be the norm. But one of the issues that we're seeing beginning to be discussed is if you do that, and then you look at the demographics, there are very different preferences for going to the office if you're a parent or not a parent. So you might end up in a world where all the non-parents are going to the office and then all the parents are staying at home. Very different preferences if you look across men and women, actually, where men prefer going to offices by I think 5 to 6 percentage points more than women. And some alarming studies have shown that if you don't do hybrid right, you can end up with differing promotion rates and career progression rates for folks who are in office versus not. And so I think this year is going to be really interesting as companies try to figure out what makes sense for them and how much they want to propose flexibility versus not. Because the failure mode of maximum flexibility is everyone does what they want, and a year later you have like these divergent diversity problems because of divergent promotion rates. So a lot of the folks I've spoken to who are looking at like mandating 3 days a week are doing so because they want to make sure that everyone's on a level playing field in a different way, which is that everyone has the same number of days in the office. My hope, and what we're working on at Remotion, is if we can help companies do the full flexible option, but still have more of a level playing field where everyone is included as a first-class citizen. Curious what others are seeing, because this stuff is like very much in flux.
I think quickly jump in. honestly very similar to what you described, and in our experience is mostly employee driven or kind of fear driven on the side of the organization when it comes to employee retention. So I know that we shared a stat, was it 39% of people considering to switch their jobs. I think many companies are building is this new flexibility and being very unclear around what the flexibility means in an attempt to retain these employees. And so that's kind of where the shift to remote is coming from our perspective. The other thing that comes to mind is when it comes to giving the full employee choice. It seems to, I wonder if there's going to be a similar conversation as we're having around unlimited vacation, where it's nice to say that it's fully flexible and fully unlimited, but then every organization creates a subculture of what it actually means, and then can it be harmful? So I think from this perspective, as you already mentioned with the parents, being one type of demographic that may or may not be coming in more, or a different gender divide. Same goes for kind of seniority. If the execs choose to come in, then suddenly it becomes a standard of sorts, and of course those growth opportunities just become different. So I think that is yet something to be figured out, and to Marissa's point, it's a challenge.
Does anyone want to take John's question, by the way? John had a pretty relevant question to this.
Yeah, we'll kind of jump into the questions, just kind of rounding up our panel discussion here. In fact, this 39% statistics is so staggering. I don't think we've kind of wrapped our heads around what this really means. This has also been called the Great Resignation, by the way, right? This is kind of the newest term that has been coined, and companies really need to understand how to achieve that, kind of agency for the employee, like you were saying, Marissa, and create that empowerment at the same time while creating, all of the other things we spoke about, the trust, the open culture, and creating an environment where remote work actually is not a compromise. It's actually becoming, the preferred choice. And kind of rounding up this discussion, I guess when we're talking about remote work, our panel is, the discussion is not complete without talking about tools. So let's kind of, quickly talk about a few things on, in terms of tools and techniques, and then we'll start taking some questions. In the meantime, if people who are on the call, the attendees, feel free to send any other questions that come to your mind. So, in terms of tools, my first question is back to Marissa about, so, if you look at smaller organizations, it's really, it's bewildering to navigate all the tools that are available to assist remote workers and remote collaboration. So, while there are specific tools for doing specific jobs, but the question is, what types of tools, would have the most impact on their team, and what should they prioritize for?
Yeah, I get the tool question a lot, actually, and I think it's usually the wrong question. So when it comes to tools, I think that how you use the tool is way more important than what tool you use. So that's important to keep in mind. So like, no matter what company you're working at, typically there's 5 tools you'll see. So there's going to be something like a knowledge base, a synchronous communication tool, reliable meeting software, an asynchronous communication tool, and then a task management system. So those would be the 5. Now, it doesn't really make a huge difference whether you choose Confluence or Notion for your knowledge base. What makes much more difference is if it's kept up to date. Can people rely on it being accurate? Or like with synchronous communication tools, picking between like Slack and Teams, it's much less important which one you choose, and it's way more important that people have like remove the default notification settings, because it'll just interrupt their workday all the time. And that's what's more important. So I think focusing on that question is really is way more important than focusing on like, oh, which tools should I use? And then the other thing is like, it might change as the tooling catches up, because like a lot of companies went remote overnight, and like we just have what we've been working with. I'm sure we're going to see an explosion of new tools this year, and it's going to be really exciting. But for now, try not to like flip-flop between a whole bunch of tools. Use what will make you comfortable, makes you happy, because that's the tool you'll be using more and will end up using in the best way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really, I mean, there's probably an overabundance of tools to choose from, and navigating what's really important for you is really critical. Alexander, are there any tools that particularly stand out for you, especially when you see how organizations have implemented them? Any examples that come to your mind?
I think first I'll plus one to what Marissa said. I think like the greatest tool is still the team, and the team has to be, you have to share with the team like, hey, how do we plan to use what we have available? What do we want to do? And people understanding what the goals are and why is much more important than the exact tool itself. I would say the biggest thing that I've seen personally, just to take one like example of a tool that has really stood out, is like there are many different knowledge management tools like for wikis, and some of them are harder to keep organized than others. And I've actually seen a lot of usage of Notion that's pretty inspiring, where folks have managed to figure out a way to keep Notion very organized, almost like by default, if it's structured in the right way. And so this is true for any tool, but if you're using a tool, I would encourage you to go like Google, like, how Notion uses Notion, or like how folks at Atlassian use Confluence or whatever, and like see what the best practices are, and like upgrading to those best practices will be like way better than changing tool, unless you realize from seeing all those best practices that your tool is like weirdly off. But that's somewhat unlikely. Obviously, I'm working on a category of tools that I'm really excited about, which is virtual offices. I think that as we've seen people figuring out how to stay connected fully remotely, virtual offices have been useful to many teams. But as we start getting to a hybrid model for some teams, like if you are trying to make hybrid work, and so I think there was a question in here, Joy's question about like, you're going to have a set of people in an office with some degree of connection. How do you level the playing field? That's where I think like, hey, you have a physical office, you have a virtual office. That is going to make a lot of sense this year. So there was already an explosion of virtual offices last year. I think it's an interesting category. And I think it's going to be even more relevant this year. So, small, humble brag, or what's it called? A plug for my own tools. You should check out Remotion.com, which is the virtual office that I think is going to work best for hybrid teams.
Yes, I remember having kind of looked at Remotion and the kind of work, the kind of like environment it creates. It's really fantastic. I would recommend everybody to give it a spin, and we'll also be sharing with our attendees links to kind of go on and try it out. I want to move this to Pavla, and so here's the thing. Like, in addition to the software tools, managing remote teams is like I was saying, it's a new paradigm for most businesses. What are some of the services or other techniques that can make remote work a great experience? And more importantly, like how can those things be leveraged to create a good company culture? Any thoughts on that, Pavla?
Definitely. Thanks for the question and enabling me to do a humble self-plug as well there. So thank you, Alexander, for starting the train. But I think similar to what Alexander was saying when it comes to, for example, virtual offices, which oftentimes tend to be more of an aggregator of how different tools that the team is already using are being leveraged in the most meaningful way, rather than being kind of its all new place, its all new eye. When it comes to thinking about employee engagement, we at WFHomie like to think about it a similar way, which is, when it comes to helping companies build relationships, build some degree of appreciation from and communicate effectively on behalf of the company, but also enable different team members to appreciate each other in a meaningful way that goes beyond just sending emojis over Slack. And of course, we're all simple creatures. Having something to touch is amazing and great, and being sent little gifts and being communicated little acts of kindness that aren't always more screen time is something that I think will become increasingly more meaningful. And at the same time, it's something that, especially for companies that are new to remote or hybrid, it's something that is extremely hard to execute on. Anything when it comes to, previously when we had the office, that oftentimes was more of a band-aid when it comes to culture and appreciation. The managers just had the corporate card and they could just bring in the Starbucks, the donuts, the pizza, do something small that in aggregate really meant that there were opportunities for people to connect, to feel like they belong and are being appreciated. And now remotely, that's something that's so hard. And so one of the first technical steps of what we're trying to help organizations with through WFHomie is give managers this kind of tool set to have it be simple again to appreciate their team members and to organize small activities where it was previously this, let's walk together for the afternoon coffee, or let's do these small things. So we're trying to see how can we create these meaningful opportunities. We're not talking about bringing the ping pong table online, but really opportunities that are worthwhile to different teams. So for teams that are looking for that, workfromhomie.com, that's how we help companies with that.
And I know some of the great work that you're doing, Pavla. That's really very, very inspiring. This has been a great discussion. There have been several takeaways from me personally, and I want to also kind of do a +1 to Alexander, you mentioned about Notion. Our own experience with Notion has been so amazing, and it's been actually liberating for us and our team. I remember when we started using it like last year, for 3 months, we only had a limited number of people on the tool. We said, unless we find a really compelling need for the company to start using this in a big way, we're not really kind of just going to jump onto the next shiny object. From there till now, if I talk about where we are today, almost everything that we do is on Notion. And we have a couple of, if I can call them like black belts, who are like so good at Notion, they can make it spin around like crazy. And if any of the attendees or anyone who's been here today wants like a 15-minute or a 30-minute kind of crash course on Notion, I'll be more than happy to schedule that with some of our black belt team members. So before we kind of jump into the Q&A, we just want to kind of remind the attendees about something. So I was mentioning at the beginning that we have a special offer from Truly Financial for everybody who stayed on until now. So the moment you sign up for Truly Financial and set up your account, there's $100 account credit that we will be enabling for you, and this is especially for for the attendees who come in today and who've managed to stay on till the Q&A. So we will send you the link to how you can register for this special offer. This is designed to give you the banking experience that you always wanted, but you just did not have it available because, hey, traditional banks are not built for small businesses. They don't understand what you need, and we want to change all of that. So let's go into the Q&A. We have a couple of questions, and we also almost at time. So hopefully we should not be kind of spilling too much over the budgeted time. So the first question that we have here is from John, and I think you were mentioning about this, Alexander. So this is along with the promotion rate changes, would it be fair to assume that in some cases expectations may be higher for people who work remotely? I'll throw it open to the panel.
Sure, I'll just jump in. Good question, John. I mean, the first thing I want to say is that I think the promotion rate changes, I'm thinking of a particular study at one particular company of 400 people in China that was done by Nick Bloom, an economist at Stanford. And that's one study. I certainly hope that those promotion rate changes do not become a thing. And for me, the value of mentioning the study is really for us to all think about that and make sure that that's not the case, and that we do our promotions also in an output-based manner. That said, so I think it's it could be different, but let's hope it's not, and let's work towards making that not true. I think the same is true about expectations. Like folks who are working remotely and folks who are not, we should make sure that we have the same expectations for them. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that we're really using good management to figure out on what are we evaluating them. That said, at some companies it may be different. I might actually imagine it would be higher for people who are in office, but hard to say.
So, John, the answer is definitely it depends. It entirely depends on your company and how they're going to run things and those managers. So if it's a type of company that has realized that judging by output is much more valuable, or by outcome is much more valuable than, more social indicators of time at the desk, then no, they won't be judged more harshly remotely. They'll actually have to do something a little different in person. But if it's one of those companies that heavily values face time, yes. So it entirely depends on your company and the managers there.
I would just plus one that no additional knowledge to share. No additional knowledge to share.
Yeah, and the other aspect of not just the promotion rate changes is also the aspect of like employee compensation. You've seen many companies, in fact the larger companies, are now talking about a differentiated compensation based on where employees live. And that's kind of getting triggered by the fact that some employees want to move away from the cities and so on. Any thoughts on what kind of approach should companies really use to deciding about compensation when they're also encouraging remote work?
I can take it if you guys. Okay, so I don't like location-based pay. I think it's very unfair to people who are working the same exact job just because of where they happen to have to be, because in a lot of cases it's from family or something outside of their control. So I'm not a huge fan of location-based pay, although it is kind of the standard in remote work right now. If you're not doing location-based pay, what you would do is you would take a set value. So let's say 50,000, and you say, this is our bare minimum that we're paying everybody. And then you would pull from one city, which typically is like a second tier city. So first tier would be like OSF or New York City, where everybody's paid really, really high dollars, versus like a second tier city would be more like Denver or Austin, where you're paid a very, very healthy salary, but it's just like a tier lower. And then you would base your pay standards off of what's being paid in those locations. So you have a set standard where there is a minimum, so everybody is being paid fairly, and then on top of that, you are comparing it to a pretty high standard of living for most of the world. So that's how I recommend doing it.
Yeah, just to chime in with slightly different point of view here. I think that location-based pay is good temporarily. In that, for me, like location-based pay is a useful sort of equalizing factor for opportunity, because like, let's say there's a company and it's based in Denver or something, right? And they're choosing who to work with. The fact that they can hire someone outside of Denver and it'll be more cost effective for them gives them an incentive to hire someone from another place where maybe they wouldn't usually have access to that opportunity. And so what we're seeing is like, or in my point of view, is that still makes sense for companies to do, to pay the market rate, but we're seeing that those market rates are rapidly converging. And so I think that meaningfully different location-based pay is going away, and it'll have largely gone away in a few years for the top tiers of skill.
Yeah, all for equitable access. Pavla, you wanted to say something?
No, I just wanted to apologize. I do have a hard stop, so I have to jump off, but thank you so much, everybody. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you for joining in. We have one last question, and then I guess we should be good on time. So this one is about how do you establish like remote norms for remote communication, and what's too much communication? How informal can it get? And also, like, how does that contribute to building trust?
You want to take it, Marissa?
Sure. Yeah. So I do not believe there is such thing as too much communication. In fact, I encourage over communication. What you think you said, oh, I said that one time in a meeting, so if I message it now, it'll mean like I'm repeating myself. No, like 20% of those people picked up on the fact that you said it during the meeting. So please write it out and, over communicate and say it again and again. So I think, let me go ahead and pull up the question again. So it was about, or was it?
It was, how do you establish norms about remote communication? How informal, how often, what's too much?
I love having documents for these kind of things. One, it helps with onboarding. So you set the standard early on. And two, it's something that people can refer back to. So I have kind of like a manager document, and I say like, oh, we speak about things in these channels about this and this channel about that, and this is where you would go for asking questions, because one of the first things that you need to set the standard for is that when someone new comes into your company, they don't know who is who. and they don't know where anything is. So making it very clear up front is incredibly important. In terms of how informal, so we set standards around like, oh, it needs to be respectful. Everybody should be okay with what's being communicated, that kind of thing. But we have a bunch of people who will play like video games together and be friends outside of work. So there really shouldn't be like a law around that, I think. It's more so leaving it up again to the individual, and then in a way that contributes to building trust. So this is where a couple things come in. So one of the things that people find is that it's really hard. Well, so what people tell me is that it's really hard to find serendipity when you're working remotely. Like in the office, you would go to the coffee station and you would, grab a cup of coffee and happen to chat with your coworker. But the thing with serendipity is it comes down to structure and permission. So you were able to get that coffee together because the company forced you to come in 9 to 5 and you were there at the same time. They created that coffee station, they had that location, like that was the structure that was in place. So if you're going to have that remotely, you need to create that structure as well. And then on top of that is the permission aspect. So like we talk about, when people go remote, they overwork, they don't underwork. So they're thinking, oh, if I message my colleagues as if they're my friends and I chat about this TV show, then I'm going to get in trouble. They're not going to see me as working, when that's really creating a bond. So you need to give that permission for people to, and it needs to be very explicit, not just like, oh, like people are allowed to, like I said, show, don't tell. So two parts of it, but yeah, I would say those are the two things.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing to that, I think like a lot of building trust is creating room for more than work. It's a lot of the non-work conversations that lead to it, right? And so making sure that it's encouraged to talk about non-work. Like you could have channels in Slack. So the beauty of putting things in public channels is other people see it's a thing. You as a leader can come in and like +1 and applaud like every time someone posts. And so now you're modeling the behavior and everyone knows it's a good thing. Another thing to consider, and this is one of the things we think about at Remotion, is a lot of trust building is the type of thing where maybe you wouldn't type out a thought, but if you were just chatting live next to the coffee machine, you would. And so like, obviously there's no remote central coffee machine, but is there a similar structure you can create for like shared experiences for people who are not in the same room, such that they have permission to like talk to each other in a sort of a lazy, casual, how is your cat way? And so, one good example of that, there are tools like Remotion that give you ways to co-work together. And you can let that be an opt-in thing. You can make it kind of fun. And then you'll be surprised at like how much trust building conversation happens in the background.
That is amazing. And I couldn't agree more, spontaneity and building trust and all of that. When we're at the other end of a wire, this is so much needed to, to create an organizational culture which is thriving. On that note, just a quick one. We ran a small survey. This was on LinkedIn, and out of about 95 responses, and this is probably no surprise, but it's kind of it's a revalidation. Only 3% of people have responded saying they want to be 100% in the office, and an overwhelming 61% have said a hybrid model fits, suits them better. And this is live data that's coming in. On that count, thank you so much, Alexander, Marissa, and to everybody who's attended the session today. This has been really illuminating, and like hearing it from you folks who've got so much experience with remote work, and there's so much of nuance that needs to be unpacked. I hope we can continue this conversation, and I hope everyone who's attended this found it useful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for organizing this.
Have a great rest of the day, and thank you once again for attending.